Hey guys, tonight we slip into a world where your best GPS is a rumor in the wind and a thumb pressed to the sun at noon. You pace the line of a hedge, counting steps between oak and stream, listening for a church bell that spills the hour like a breadcrumb trail. A carved cross on a weathered post tilts in the dusk. A road bends not because a surveyor said so, but because a farmer's cow once insisted. You trade directions in stories. Follow the road that smells like apples. Turn where the bridge hums after rain, keep the hill on your left until it argues. You probably won't survive this in the sense that a few minutes from now, you'll be peacefully asleep halfway to somewhere that doesn't need a map. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you are listening from, and your local time down in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. How people found directions before reliable maps. You begin with a road that is more idea than architecture, two grooves of habit stitched through grass and memory. You walk because the road expects it of you, because your feet know more than your mouth, because when the hedge curls and the ditch glitters and the wind changes its handwriting, the path still holds your ankle like a friendly hand. You keep the sun where you can see it, a bright coin you spend carefully, and you rehearse the old trick thumb at arm's length, your personal budget sextant, measuring how far daylight has crawled since breakfast. It's not mathematically impressive, but it behaves, and that's all a traveler ever asks. The road goes where stories go. You accept that a bend means somebody's cow once had a priority, that a sudden straight means Romans with opinions, that a hop over a brook means the path got tired of getting its socks wet. You listen for bells, metal voices in the air, because bells tell time and place at once. You don't need a map to know where a bell belongs. It sketches a village on the inside of your skull. The loudness draws a circle. The echo puts you on its edge. The pitch says which parish keeps late hours. You smile at the subtlety of it, at the way the world leaves you breadcrumbs if you pretend to be a bird. You pass across at a fork, weather gnawed, its arms worn down to shrugging. The cross doesn't exactly say this way, but it does what old signs do, it keeps company. Someone set it here because crossroads are indecisive, and people like an adult in the room. You nod because that's what you do to things that watched you grow up, even if you're meeting for the first time. Above you, a rooster on a church weathercock squeaks in the breeze. He points unhelpfully toward the direction the wind came from, which at least tells you what to complain about. You keep land on your right, river on your left, sky where the sky belongs. A twig scratches your sleeve, and you remember a saying picked up 2 parishes ago. Follow the water that sounds busy, if you want a town. Follow the water that broods if you want a mill. Is it true? Maybe, but it fits in the pocket with your bread and doesn't take up space. You develop a bag of such things, light superstitions and heavier facts, and between them you stitch a route. First joke of the road, you tell yourself you're navigating. The road laughs gently and says you're being navigated. Mainstream fact wanders in, quiet and useful. Many medieval churches in Europe are built on an east-west line, the altar toward the sunrise, ad orientem, because prayer and light have an old friendship. If you can find a church, and if you can see its bones beneath the little habits of builders and hills, you can find the 4 directions the way you find the door in your own house at night. You glance at a nave and think, all right, the dawn is there, then your feet do the trigonometry of which way home must be. It is not perfect, nothing about earth and stone ever is, but it places you like a thumb on a page. You pay attention to the ground the way a baker pays attention to flour. Hollow ways sink between banks where centuries of hooves and wheels chewed the clay low. They flow like careless rivers, proof that people are extremely good at repetition. You walk inside one, and feel the old traffic passing through you, a parade of ghosts who all had somewhere to be before sunset. You keep a finger on your staff where the bark is smooth. You scrape it now and then at a corner to leave a whisper of yourself behind. You're not littering, you're practicing a private navigation, breadcrumbing the world with evidence of your survival. A woman with a yoke of pails trudges toward you, leaning like a ship in chop. You trade greetings and then trade topographies. 2 fields, then the older clump, then the footbridge that looks like a bad decision, she says. Keep the chalk pit on your left, the dogs at the farm nip, but only if you run. She tells you about a waypost carved with a hand that points the wrong way, because the carver's cousin had a sense of humor. She tells you about the white stone that glows on moonlit nights, and how to avoid the bog that looks like ground until it decides not to be. You thank her as if she has lent you a cup of tea. You walk away carrying her weather in your pocket. Quirky tidbit drops in, dusted with folklore. Some routes are called corpse roads in parts of England, paths for carrying the dead to consecrated ground from scattered hamlets. They tend to be direct, they tend to be stubborn, and they tend to have stories attached, because nothing encourages tidy storytelling like sober errands. You do not walk one tonight, you hope, but you keep the idea handy. A path that knows exactly where it is going is a good companion, when you don't. The sun slides, your shadow pivots, the hour's back loosens. You do the simplest astronomy a human can do, shadow at noon shortest, and pointing northish in the northern world. Morning and evening swap places like friendly thieves. If you are lucky you have a bit of string and a pin for a tiny gnomon, and time enough to draw circles on a scrap of plank, laying out a makeshift compass that would fail a ship, but will rescue a walker. If you are luckier, a cloud behaves and you simply remember that your body has been calibrated for this planet since before you learned your first prayer. Historians still argue whether ordinary villagers thought in distances or in times. You muse, stepping over a rut deep enough to have its own citizenship. The debate is practical. Did people say 5 miles, or did they say 2 hours and a bit if the mud cooperates? The road grins and says both, depending on whose boots you're in. You personally measure by stories. How long until you reach the tree that looks like a disappointed aunt, the bridge that hums after rain, the inn with the boastful sign? When you move by narrative, the milestones are memories, and the journey is a rosary you finger without noticing. At a crossing where 3 tracks dispute the future, you stand still the way a deer stands still, all senses out, nothing dramatic. You smell smoke, but not the comfortable kind. Someone is burning brush sharp and green. You hear children in the kind of laughter that means we are near adults and therefore safe. You see the pale line of a path well licked by hooves because someone trusted it last week. You pick your road the way a singer picks a note, not because it's written somewhere, but because it feels right in the mouth. Second joke, you call this gut-based cartography, and your gut, which is mostly bred today, asks for a more scientific name. Another mainstream fact joins you with a scholarly nod. The magnetic compass comes into European texts in the late 12th century. Alexander Neckham, writing in the 1190s, mentions sailors using a needle rubbed with lodestone to find the north when the stars sulk behind clouds. Land travelers, especially merchants and messengers, eventually borrow the trick. You've seen one once, a little box that smells like oil and leather, a floating card that wobbles towards certainty and then decides to be certain after all. You don't own one, you own patience and a noisy brain. But you imagine the comfort, the way a needle's cleverness turns guesswork into craft. Historians still argue whether compasses were common on land before the 15th century, says the voice in your head that likes footnotes. That's fine. You trust that the abundance of things in a traveler's hands, bread, staff, bundle, someone's letter tied in twine, discourages devices unless they pay for their weight. You remember the time you tried to carry a pot, because it might be useful and discovered that might is a very heavy word. You keep moving, lighter than argument. The day's light grows honey thick, and people begin to recall where their evenings sleep. You pass a finger post where one wooden arm reads market and the other reads mill, and a third, more mysterious, simply shrugs at the unknown. Finger posts are a newish fashion in some places, a cousin to older stone markers that let you know how far you're getting into your own story. Roman milestones still haunt some roads. A mile a mill passes, 1,000 paces that believed in standardization long before you did. You touch one, fingertip to cold inscription, and it's like tapping a fossil, all the creatures of empire swimming just under the surface of now. You taste the air the way a cook tastes a broth, looking for salt and direction. Smoke goes somewhere, you go the other way. If you want clear lungs, you go toward it. If you want a roof, you glance at the trees, because someone once told you moss grows on the north side. It grows on the side that stays damp, which is sometimes north and sometimes congratulations. The wind and the hill and the shade played dice together. Third joke, you tell the nearest oak to please pick a side and stick with it. The oak tells you it has other priorities, like being an oak. Night threatens, but not with claws, more with a soft hat pulled low. You start to count stars before they've entirely appeared, a habit that makes you feel more capable than perhaps you are. If Polaris peeks through the milk of evening, you steady yourself with it, the lantern nailed near the top of the world. You know it is not exactly on the pole, not the way a dot sits on an eye. It wobbles a little because the earth is a fidgeter. That's enough for tonight. You're not drawing charts. You're deciding between left and right. A dog barks at your future, and then loses interest. You come to a bridge where the water speaks too fast to be lyrical. On a post sits a small badge nailed in tin, some traveler's token lost and repurposed as decoration. In towns you've seen sellers of such badges, saints hammered into soft metal to pin on hats and say, "I've been where you've been." Badges work as conversation starters, and often as informal passports. Gatekeepers recognize the shape of the shrine you claim, and decide they've met your kind before. A life of being recognized makes doors friendlier. Quirky tidbit dangles from the eaves of your mind in a few regions. Travelers memorized little rhymes that encode routes, by ash and by alder, by millstone and boulder, and so on. Earworms that bite your ankle just when you most need them. You sing under your breath, the way a person chews a thought, and the rhythm matches your walk and therefore your confidence. The rhyme says, "Turn where the road narrows, and the air smells of mint." It is not precise, but neither are you, and the companionship is worth its weight. You cross the kind of meadow that believes in dew, and beyond it, a line of willows that believe in leaning. A distant tower draws a line against the violet hour. You can tell by the fatness of the stone and the modesty of the window that the tower belongs to defense, not to prayer. That tells you about borders, which tells you about markets, which tells you about where to rest your head and whom to pay for the privilege. You steer a little to aim for safety disguised as commerce. Historians still argue whether most travelers knew large-scale geography or sifted the world through a sieve of local knowledge, you think, stepping onto a lane lined with cart-worn cobbles. Did the average person carry a mental Europe, or just a recipe of nearby? You carry a recipe, but it includes spices, the rumor of a river 2 days east that tastes of lime in the teeth, the whisper of a road called the Salt Way, the knowledge that if you walk where herders walk, you will eventually reach a place that buys wool. Big maps are noble, small maps are edible. Twilight becomes a habit, rather than an event. You pass a wayside shrine, tiny as a thought but bright with someone's fresh flower, and pause the way a polite person pauses at an open door. You have learned that shrines like this tend to multiply at corners, where decisions need blessing. They also mark memory, where something happened, someone fell, someone rose, someone promised. They are as much navigation for the heart as for the boot, but a guided heart walks straighter. A boy trudges past with a bundle of kindling, and the practiced suspicion of children raised in places with visitors. This way to, you ask, which is not a complete sentence, but road grammar fills it in. He gestures, a flick like a fish, and you understand that the track by the hedgerow saves you a muddy detour. Don't go through the lower field, he adds, the goose thinks it's a dog. Fourth joke, you bow to the goose when you meet it, and practice the kind of diplomacy usually reserved for minor nobles. Your stomach reminds you that geography is also the study of bread. You inventory, a heel like a philosophy professor, a bit of cheese considering rebellion, an onion plotting tears. You decide to aim for an inn, which is a word that means place with stew, and place with news, and place with someone who knows where the road went last week. In the doorway of such places, the real maps are murmured, names, distances, warnings, triumphs, ink that never dries because it's made of breath. If you were to draw it, you would paint circles around people, not around mountains. The first star sharpens, the second encourages it. You keep the Big Dipper on one shoulder, and your faith on the other. You recall, absurdly yet usefully, that if you extend the line from the Dipper's 2 far bowl stars, it points toward Polaris. You extend imaginary lines everywhere, like a child drawing on foggy glass. The sky obliges, a teacher who likes your enthusiasm. Sometimes this is enough to tell you whether you're drifting. Sometimes it merely convinces you that you are magical. Both are valuable skills in their way. You arrive at a place that has decided to be an inn rather than a barn. The signboard shows a stag that looks like a horse who read the wrong script. Painted words encourage a literate passerby to admire the landlord's spelling. You go in. Heat embraces you with the authority of soup. You claim a corner, and let your ears do the walking. Merchants speak in routes, soldiers in posts, drovers in pastures, monks in distances between prayers. You drink the talk and catch crumbs. The ferry west runs only if the ferryman's wife is in a good mood. The bridge north lost a tooth. There's a communal bake tomorrow, and so the road to the ovens will be crowded with news you could use. Someone at the table mentions a chart, a real one, ink and vellum, a treasure for ship, and occasionally for land. Someone else produces what looks like a laundry list, but is actually an itinerary, town names in sequence with numbers that mean days not miles. The Antonine itinerary, they say, for those who like old Roman bureaucracy. But in truth, most of what anyone needs lives in the head of the oldest person in the room. You ask, and the oldest person answers, and your world gets larger and smaller at once. Night wraps the house. You let your shoulders sink. You plan tomorrow's directions, the way you plan dreams. You will go by the lane that smells of apples, because orchards love the company of roads. You will keep the hill on your left until it argues, then negotiate. You will seek the spire that looks like a finger lifted to hush a town. You will cross water that thinks in syllables rather than sentences. You will arrive somewhere that didn't know it was expecting you, and yet set a place. One last debate sits on the stool beside you, companionable as a cat. Historians still argue whether medieval travelers were lost as often as we assume. You smile into your cup. Lost, you think, is a modern luxury. Back then you were simply not there yet. You learned to hear the land the way a child learns to hear a parent in a crowded room. You learned that continuity, the road resuming after a hedge, the path appearing after a bend, is a kind of promise the world keeps if you keep walking. Before you climb the creaky stairs, you step outside to let the night say its piece. The yard smells of damp straw and horses with opinions. The sky has drawn its map in fine white chalk. You stand there a moment with your head tilted, a human sundial retired for the day, and you feel the lines connect, bell to tower, tower to river, river to bridge, bridge to lane, lane to gate, gate to bed. You didn't need a reliable map, because the world has been drawing itself for you since morning, and you were awake enough to notice. Fifth joke, a sleepy one. You promise the road you'll get lost tomorrow, just to make it feel useful. The road, which is older than your jokes, promises back that it will find you anyway. You go to bed, knowing directions not as arrows but as friendships. You will wake and put your thumb to the sun, and the day will open like a door, it meant to open all along. And when someone asks you how you knew where to go, you will say the true thing that sounds like a poem. I looked, I listened, I walked, and the world answered. Morning reels you in with the slow pull of bread scent, and a door latch clacking somewhere downstairs. You wake with the comfortable confusion of travel, a ceiling you don't own, a blanket that remembers other sleepers, the faint ache of ankles that negotiated with stones all yesterday. You sit up and listen before you move. Are the voices busy market day, hushed Sunday, or argumentative every other day? A cart rolls past, soft thumps of iron rim over rut. A mule commenting in vowels. The day gives you its first coordinates as sound. You step outside into the kind of air that hasn't yet chosen a mood. The yard points you with its own silent grammar, paths rubbed pale by many feet, a gate that swings easier in one direction than the other, a stack of broomwood arranged for loading towards somewhere that buys brooms. You butter your bread with guesswork, and eat the guesswork first. Then you set off again. You aim for the ridge because ridges behave like extroverts. They want to be seen. Travel high if the weather allows. You can see where you're going, and more importantly, where you're accidentally not. The ridge path is thin and stony, stitched with sheep droppings that spell out the news in pellets. Below, a valley keeps its secrets in folds, but up here the land unfolds like a letter from a friend who writes clearly. Mainstream fact walks alongside you, nodding at the horizon. Many long-distance routes in Britain and on the continent favored high ground. The old ridgeways, not out of romance but for dryness, visibility, and the kind of neutrality that keeps you off someone's valuable crops. Your shadow is an obedient dog. You learn more from where it tries to run than from where it sits. On the first summit, a pile of stones stares into the weather. It's been added to one fist-sized truth at a time by people who wanted to tell whoever came next. Yes, this is the way. You add your own stone, because you're polite, and because participation makes memory grip harder. A crow treats the cairn like a lectern, and caws a speech about breakfast. You agree with the thesis and take a bite of your last apple. In your head you keep a private grammar of terrain. A clapper bridge means more. A single arched packhorse bridge with parapets only at the ends means a trade lane that doesn't like fat wagons. A causeway dipped in cobbles says wet ground and shared stubbornness. Down the far slope you pass a great boundary ditch with a hedge, so old it might have opinions older than you. Hedgerows are sentences the land wrote centuries ago. You read them as you go. Hawthorn means no one wanted cattle arguing with neighbors. Hazel suggests coppice and baskets. Oak means patience and property lines drawn by people who thought in generations. You follow a line where two hedges pinch together, and know without needing anyone to explain, that this is the squeeze where traffic negotiated politeness long before you arrived. Quirky tidbit tries out an anecdote. Some parishes in England beat the bounds on rogation days, doing a yearly walking blessing of their borders. Boys were sometimes bumped gently on boundary stones or inverted through hedges, so they'd remember the lines with their bones. You grin at the memory of a tale told by a miller last winter. They didn't beat me hard, just enough to make me an expert in where not to trespass. Those yearly perambulations make splendid navigation for people like you. Boundaries that were sung and bumped into memory are hard to lose. At a crossroads, a small crowd coalesces like dough rising. Drovers, a peddler with bells that admit he's selling tin spoons and information. A woman whose cart is mostly turnips and exactly 2 news items. You trade. They tell you the lower ford is sulking since the storm. The ferry is running, but the ferryman counts passengers like he's auditioning for a monastery. The hill road is shorter if your knees are proud. Someone draws a quick sketch on the dirt with a stick. Nothing you'd frame, just 2 squiggles for rivers, a square for a tower, a line of dots where the path vanishes in bracken then reappears like a shy friend. You cherish these improvised maps like short poems. You step back as a cow demonstrates an opposing view by putting a hoof directly on the square. 5th joke, delivered with dignity. Excellent, you say to the cow. I too have questions about urban planning. You angle toward a church because bells keep better time than you do. The tower's door has a deep groove where hands have lifted its latch since latches were invented. You press your palm to the groove and feel yourself adopted by the parish for the 2 minutes you need. Inside, you ask for the direction of the nearest market. A woman mending a surplice points with a needle. Follow the old Roman. If you can find it where the wheat lets you, she says. It's the straight line that disapproves of geography. Mainstream fact, cleaning its spectacles. Roman roads left their bones everywhere. Aggers, straight embankments that keep marching even after their paving stones have been taxied into farmyards. Find one and you've bought yourself a strand of certainty. You climb the stile, and there it is, a dead straight in tent slicing fields that have other ideas. You walk it as far as it will let you. Historians still argue whether locals in the Middle Ages valued the Roman lines or mostly cannibalized them for stone. You think hopping from one dry patch to the next. The evidence is messy, the way evidence insists on being. You don't trouble the question long. The road you are on is helpful enough to get a thank you and stubborn enough to get a nickname. By midday, heat turns your pack straps into opinions. You settle in the flicker shade of a pollarded willow and practice pocket astronomy. You use your staff to cast a small shadow and mark its end with a pebble. Wait, mark again. Draw the arc, bisect it. You've made yourself a north-south line crude enough to make a real navigator. Roll his eyes and precise enough to keep you from walking in circles. You sip from your skin and feel like a scholar outwitting thirst. Overhead, swifts carve their punctuation into the sky. Somewhere the smell of yeast says bread is becoming future bread. You reach a stone with a cross carved shallowly, waymarker and prayer in one. It stands at a fork where the left path is broader but sulks, and the right is narrow but ambitious. You remember the peddler's stick sketch and take the ambitious route, figuring ambition likes company. Along this path, small niches appear in walls and tree trunks, little shrines with damp candles. They make a breadcrumb trail of devotion. You let them point your feet. In one niche a tin badge glints, the scallop shell of St. James. The road to Compostela is elsewhere, but the badge has traveled, and the idea of it helps. A pilgrim road knows how to be a road. You trust roads that know themselves. Quirky tidbit flutters down. Some shrines double as weather stations, tellers of wind and rain by the angle of soot blown inside. More than one traveler has checked whether saint and candle conspired to leave a black smudge toward the sea. Is that good science? Not really. Is it travel science? Absolutely. You nod to the smudge and keep going. You meet a reeve on a horse whose hooves look like they've read the accounts and disagree. He gives you the thin smile of a man who loves tidy fields. You give him the thick grin of a person passing through. Is this the way to? You begin again, letting road grammar fill the blank. He points with a whip. Keep the gallows on your right. He says matter-of-factly, meaning the old empty frame on the hill that locals mention as if it were a barn. Then the lane between the 2 oaks like arguing brothers. After that, watch for the stone that looks like a bishop wearing a hat. Directions by Sculpture Garden. Excellent. You thank him like you've been loaned a tool. Historians still argue whether people navigated more by official markers or by communal nicknames. You mull, stepping past the arguing oaks, both correct, both loud. The written world exists, charters, perambulations, boundaries with Latin in their teeth. But the spoken world gets between your boot and the ground first. You collect the spoken names: Dogleg, Suitor's Dip, Widow's Turn, the Devil's Knee. A map made of those would be impossible to publish, and perfect to live in. In a village green, the market cross hums with flies and gossip. Someone has nailed a notice promising a fair in 3 weeks, ink browned by past weathers. The cross itself is worn the way a favorite step is worn. You touch it and feel the traffic of centuries in your fingertips. Mainstream fact leans in market crosses and standing crosses often marked gathering places and routes, serving as both spiritual focal points and navigational anchors. If you can find one, you can find a day's worth of directions with it. You listen to 3 different versions of a road from 3 different mouths and triangulate by the only instrument you own, your instinct for who sounds like they carry their feet honestly. As afternoon slopes, you walk beside a river that talks to itself. Rivers are the original arrows. If you need the sea, you let them pull you. If you need the source, you bargain against the pull with snacks and optimism. You read the banks the way a hunter reads tracks. Willows lean where they are indulged. Alders line stretches that flood. Reeds say shallows, foamy eddies suggest stones that would enjoy meeting your shins. You keep the river at an assigned shoulder according to your plan, and now and then you climb a little to verify that shoulder is still the one you intended. The water, as usual, does not care about your plan but proves useful anyway. You camp before evening finishes its slow arithmetic. Not in the obvious spot, that meadow already belongs to insects and regrets, but in the fold of an old hedge where nobody's dog will feel obligated to offer a loud opinion. You build a tiny fire that thinks small thoughts, and you eat like a person who has discovered the secret spice of hunger. When the sky darkens into map again, you let the constellations do their ancient job. Polaris steadies the top of the night. Cassiopeia rocks back like a chair. The Dipper points like a good friend who can't resist telling you where the bathrooms are. If cloud makes the stars act shy, you take the flavor of the wind and the smell of the damp and triangulate with your memory of the river's bend. This is not math. This is older than math. Another mainstream fact pads in quietly. Portal uncharts. Those crisp, wind-rose-sprinkled sea maps start appearing in the 13th century for Mediterranean sailors, who prefer lines and rums to angels and allegory. On land though, the maps most people might glimpse are mappy mundi, glorious theological diagrams like the Hereford map, full of paradise and monsters, and less concerned with tomorrow's left turn. The Gough map of Britain, from the 14th century, pulls toward modern usefulness, naming towns and sketching roads, but it lives in halls and libraries, not in your pocket. Which is fine. Your pocket is taken up by bread. Historians still argue whether ordinary travelers ever saw maps at all. You think, watching a moth practice bad decisions near your flame. Maybe a few did. Maybe a steward unrolled one for show. Maybe a monk sketched a plan in the margins of a charter while explaining a road to a visiting brother. You've seen an itinerary written like a recipe. Salisbury to Winchester, one day. Winchester to Romsey, half if the river behaves. That's your kind of cartography. Measured in conversations and stew. When the fire goes to coal, you go to quilt. The earth under you is not a bed but has learned to pretend when asked nicely. You lie there listening to the thick silence that grows in hedgerows after the last bird tucks its head back under its wing. You rehearse tomorrow. Keep the hill with the old quarry on your right. Look for the Lichgate and the yews, because yews mean churchyards, and churchyards mean someone to ask. Trust the path that looks recently used even if it looks less official. If the sky is kind, follow the line where light pulls longer in the west. If the sky isn't, follow the gossip of stones. You dream in place names and wake before dawn. The east's first bruised peach color does the generous work of telling you which way is east, as if it were a secret you'd earned. You move quiet as a thought, and the day unrolls itself belly up for you to scratch. You cross a causeway, where the reeds lean like bad listeners. You step into a lane whose center ridge proves that carts avoid it in wet weather, and you avoid it too. You choose the track with recent manure, because animals always know where water is, and people always know where animals are, and markets always know where people are, and that chain is as reliable as any printed atlas. Drovers are up ahead again, clouds of sheep like ambulatory foam. Their lead dog grants you a visa after a full sniff-based interview. You ask if the ridge road still goes where it used to. A man with a hat wide enough to be a roof says, mostly, which is the most honest answer in any century. It avoids tolls when it can, he adds. So do I, you say, and he grins. Historians still argue whether drovers chose ridge roads chiefly to dodge tolls, or simply to keep hooves dry. You think, cheerful at the way motives braid like rushes into one practical basket. By late morning you can smell a town, yeast and horse and metal and cabbage doing their sunrise dance. A timbered gate leans out like a cousin, who wants to see whether you've grown. A signboard points with assertive spelling. Beneath it, a milestone from some older ambition peeks from the weeds, numbers rubbed vague by how many visitors read them with their fingers. You have arrived not because a line on paper delivered you, but because bells, hedges, bridges, stars, stones, rhymes, and other people combined into a chorus that sang you in tune. You stand in the square, breathing like a person who has walked from breakfast to now and has a plan for lunch. In your pocket, directions have resolved into a short list of reliables: listen for bells, watch the water, seek the high, the dry, and the recently used trust shrines, to cluster where choices matter, ask the oldest voice, keep the sun where your thumb understands it, and if all else fails, befriend a dog. You look up at the inn sign, at the creature painted there, a unicorn, if the painter had optimism, a goat if he ran out of unicorn, and smile at the same quiet thought as last night. The world has been drawing itself for you all day. You rid it, slowly with your feet. Landmarks, crosses and story roads. You set out in the kind of morning that smells like wet bark and warm bread, when light pulls itself up over the hedges, as if it needs a minute to remember how. The lane ahead is a long thought with muddy punctuation. You follow it because it invites you, not bossy, just confident, the way a table invites plates. Your boots talk quietly to the ruts. Your cloak practices being a very slow flag. Directions today won't come from anything folded or inked. They'll come from what's large enough to insist on being noticed, and old enough not to brag about it. You begin by collecting giants. There's the oak that leans out of its own trunk like a retired knight telling a story. Bark-armored branches full of small decisions. There's the chalk scar on the far hillside that shows white through the grass like the bone of the world. There's the church spire, a tidy finger raised against the morning, as if to remind everyone to use indoor voices. You keep them arranged in your head as if they were chess pieces, and you are trying not to be checkmated by uncertainty. Keep the oak to your right, the hill scar at 11 o'clock, the spire peeking occasionally through roofs. It's not cartography, it's choreography. You dance with the land, and the land leads. A wayside cross meets you at the first true choice, a worn stone shaft on a square plinth, its arms suggested more than stated, the kind of thing 1,000 hands have touched while deciding where to go. Lichen writes its slow gospel on the stone. Somebody has left a posy of hedgerow flowers in the crack, and the morning has signed the petals with dew. You touch the cross and say nothing. It doesn't answer, also saying nothing, which is the kind of conversation you prefer before breakfast. The path to the left appears smug. The path to the right gives you a modest shrug. You rid the ground, where the grass has been pressed recently, where cartwheels have shaved the mud smooth, and you pick the shrug. The world is always better at telling the truth when it isn't trying too hard. Mainstream fact slides in like a helpful librarian. Throughout medieval Europe, stone crosses stood at crossroads, parish boundaries, markets and places where people gathered to trade or pray or wait for someone to stop being late. They were devotional, yes, but they were also practical. Public posts for proclamations, landmarks you could feel in your bones. You walk past this one and feel its practicality, like a gentle hand between your shoulder blades. There, it says. This way is a way for a reason. The lane opens into a green with a market cross at its center, taller and more confident than its wayside cousin. The base is carved into steps, worn to soft crescents by gossip and knees. The shaft rises, lantern bright in your mind even though it's plain stone, and atop it sits a weathered capital that thinks it remembers a saint. You stand on one of the steps and turn slowly, using the cross as you might a lighthouse if you were braver and wetter. You note how the alleys lean toward it, how the eye is drawn. In a place like this, directions are handed out by habit. The road to the mill is the one that smells like grain, someone tells you, which is helpful in the same way that saying soup is wet is helpful, accurate, but a little too enthusiastic about obvious truths. Quirky tidbit, courtesy of a local whose grandfather loved a good errand. Not far from here, there's a coffin stone, a flat slab where pallbearers used to rest on the way to burial. It sits like a pause in the grass. The root bends to meet it, because people always bent to mercy where they could. Over time the bend became a rule, the road kept even when no coffin needed it. You imagine the weight lowered, the grateful shoulders, the murmured prayers, and how such a place becomes a dot on everyone's mental map. Turn after the stone, where grief catches its breath. You move on, and the day begins to wear its larger face. Hedges trade gossip across the lane, whispers of birdsong, and the smell of crushed nettle. A stile invites your boot to practice grace. You take the higher path, and it hurries you to a brow where the world spreads itself like a picnic. Far off, a ruined tower stands like a molar in a mouthful of hills. Closer, a gallows hill, empty now, just a frame that rusted out of use, raises its stark geometry against the soft field. Grim, yes, but also useful. You put it into your kit of mental lighthouses with a little apology. A landmark is a landmark, even when it used to make speeches no one wanted to hear. Historians still argue whether crosses and other sacred markers were primarily devotional, or whether communities planted them as much for direction and jurisdiction, as a "you are now entering" sign with manners, you think. Half smiling, at how the answer would be both, if the past could be coaxed into modern questionnaires. The cross doesn't care about categories, it cares about being there, and you, not to brag, are excellent at finding things that insist on being there. Story roads begin to unroll from your mouth before you realize you've started speaking. Past the big ash that looks like a lad bending to tie his shoe. You murmur, then the lumpy lane that stubbed 5 cartwheels last spring, then turn where the air changes and smells like apples, even when it isn't harvest. You've learned that telling the route like a bedtime tale irons the creases out of distance. A good story road isn't poetry about the path, it's the path disguised as memory. If someone asked you for a map, you'd hand them a paragraph with 3 jokes and a warning about geese. A boy with a straw hat, and a ferret in his pocket. You just know passes you and points without being asked. That way's faster if you don't like mud, he says. That way's prettier if you do. You ask which he chose. I've got the ferret, he says. Like that answers everything, which in a way it does. You take the faster way because your socks wrote an addendum to the Constitution about mud last week. The faster way goes by a standing stone that looks like the world's oldest toothpick. It has a hole drilled near the top, worn smooth by fingers and weather, and the stubbornness of vows. Couples used to clasp hands through it and promise what couples always promise, to keep going in the same direction long enough to earn matching wrinkles. Travelers sometimes looped a ribbon through it as insurance or gratitude. You pause and pass your fingers through the hole, an echo of a handshake with time. The stone's coolness steadies you, and the road approves the ritual. You stop at a cottage, where the eaves bow politely, and the dog looks like he was appointed minister of puddles. The woman at the door is mending a shirt with the authority of someone who can mend much more complicated things if necessary. You ask which way to the ford. She nods at the field behind the cottage. Aim for the ash, not the willow, she says. The willow tells you secrets, but mostly about falling in. She gestures again. When you smell mint, you're almost there. When you smell sheep, you're exactly there. You thank her with bread you can spare, and the kind of gratitude that comes with relief. People are the best landmarks because they answer back. Mainstream fact wanders along with your next steps like a companionable monk. In many places, parishioners beat the bounds every spring, walking the border of the parish together, singing litanies, tapping boundary stones, and making a memory palace out of ditches, hedges, and trees. Children were sometimes bumped gently over a bank or under a hedge, so they'd remember the boundary with their bones. The result is a shared sung map in people's heads. You picture the procession, banners, bread, laughter, the careful solemnity of someone telling a joke near holy things, and it feels exactly like the sort of communal cartography that survives the absence of paper. You cross a field where the furrows run as straight as a lecture. A magpie chides you for stepping in the wrong place, which is all places, according to magpies. The field lifts to a lane roofed in hazel, a cool tunnel that tastes like shade. At the far end, another cross, this one a wooden post with iron nailed on in the shape of a thin, patient savior. Wind has chewed at the wood, and the iron has bled a little rust into the grain, but the figure still opens his arms to bless whichever way you go. Someone has scratched an arrow on the post below. You like the mixture, devotion handling the cosmic, arrow handling the rest. You turn where the arrow implores, because ignoring earnestness feels unkind. The track threads between ponds mirror still, except for flies drawing calligraphy. Somewhere nearby, a mill wheel speaks in syllables. Clack, hush, clack, a sleepy rhythm your feet fall into without asking. The mill is a landmark that smells like flour and ambition. You stand in its shadow, and watch bags of grain get taller before they get lighter. The miller has the look of someone who can measure whether a rain cloud is worth rescheduling for. You ask about the next stretch. He wipes his hands. Keep to the causeway, he says. It's the dry honesty between two lying swamps. Fifth joke arrives on schedule. You assure him you too value dry honesty, though you will accept damp sincerity in a pinch. Quirky tidbit taps you on the shoulder. In some valleys, the road bends abruptly around a lone hawthorn because locals believe it's a fairy tree, untouchable, unlucky to move, consulted more than visited. The engineers of the future will diagram the curve and frown. You today will walk it gladly, grateful for any superstition that prevents the world from getting entirely straightened. The hawthorn hums with bees and rumor. You skirt it with a little bow that you pretend is for the bees and isn't at all for any audience you can't see. Midday slackens the world into a yawn. Heat presses your cloak to your back like a clingy cat. You cut across a common, where the grass is grazed down to ideas, and the geese have established a foreign policy. A shepherd, elbow on staff in the classic pose of I am watching, but in a relaxed way, nods toward a ridge. Follow the old drove, he says. Keep the barrow on your left. Don't wake it. By barrow he means a burial mound, smooth as a whale's back under the grass. The drove road is easy to recognize. Two shallow parallel troughs, with a generous strip between, as if the road insisted on room for minds to wander. You step into it and feel the faint exhale of centuries of hooves. Historians still argue whether story roads were knit from formal oral tradition, mnemonic strings everyone shared, or whether they were personal, local recipes improvised from whatever stuck in a traveler's head. You consider jaw busy with a crust that fights back. The answer is probably that everything is everything. A common spine of well-known markers, fleshed out by private landmarks, only you would notice. A certain fence post shaped like a bishop's staff, a puddle that always keeps one corner. The way the wind smells like someone baking pears when it's about to rain. What matters isn't whether the story is official, it's whether it gets you to the spoon. The drove climbs, and gives you a view that's almost smug. On one horizon, a strip of pale where chalk rides close to the surface, on the other a smear of forest with a spine of darker conifers, planted you guess to assert somebody's taste and boundary. Between, the world ripples with hedges and roofs, and the occasional glare of water, where a pond pretends to be a small flat sky. You count spires and wind-twisted oaks, and memorize the order like beads on a cord: spire, oak, pond, hill, cross. You walk toward the next bead, and let your breath be the string. By a gate gnawed into friendliness, there's a finger post, a newer habit in some places, wooden arms pointing with painted letters that have weathered into whispering. Market, one says ferry, says another, and the third simply says home, which is an odd thing to find on a finger post, unless the carver had a sense of humor, or a moment of unsupervised sentiment. You lift your eyes along the direction that claims home, and see nothing but hedges, and an optimistic cloud. You decide the carver put it there to make strangers smile. It works. You take the ferry road anyway, because water and you have an understanding you like to cross it. It likes to watch. The ferry is a plank persuaded into a profession. The ferryman has one of those faces that looks like someone carved it from oak, and then forgot to varnish. Down river, or up? He asks, shorthand for, are you in a hurry to leave or to arrive? You pay with coins and a small anecdote, the price of cross-water advice. He nods toward a line of pollarded willows on the far bank. Follow the stumps, he says. They're the parish's memory. They know the boundary better than the reeve. You step off onto mud that thinks too highly of itself, and make for the willows, those stubborn lollipops of regrowth. Afternoon sifts itself toward evening with lazy fingers. You walk through a hamlet where the houses look like they were put down gently, and then patted to settle. In the square a notice is nailed to the cross. It announces a fair day with a flourish and 3 exclamation points, which is either civic enthusiasm, or an apprentice learning punctuation. Beneath the notice, someone has chalked an arrow, and the word cheese, which you strongly suspect is the work of a vigilante helpful person. You love this so much that you briefly consider changing your plan. But your plan is the story you're telling your own feet, and the feet are enjoying the current plot. You breathe in the long honey of late light. Down by the road, an old boundary stone slumps in the grass, its chiseling mostly rubbed to sleep by sheep and touch. You run your fingers along its face the way you would along a sentence you like, and you feel the faint economy of older names. Beyond the stone, the lane slips into a hollow way, the earth foot-worn until its shoulders rise above you like walls. Ferns drape their green lace over the banks. It is cool here, and thoughtful. You can imagine being guided entirely by the hollow way. If the night comes too soon, put one hand on the bank and let the earth usher you along like a patient usher with a single candle and excellent shoes. The hollow way releases you into a meadow that has opinions about crickets. On the far side, a shrine sits in a niche of old brick, the Virgin painted in the pastels of someone's best effort and recent rain, her face a little melted by weather, but still kind. A candle nub hides behind a stone lip. You drop a pebble in the niche, not a coin, which you need, but a clean round pebble from the river, to say thank you for the directions she didn't technically give you. The next choice appears exactly where such shrines tend to live, at a fork that could split two futures. You take the left because the right smells like a confession you're not ready to make. Evening tucks the edges of the sky in the way a careful aunt tucks sheets. You count up what you've learned today, not like a student, but like a baker, counting the bread left at closing, landmarks that stand still and wait for you. Crosses that both bless and point, story roads that fit in your mouth and carry you forward like a song. People who loan you their eyes for a mile, and their best cautionary tales for free. You think of how steady it all feels, how unpanicky, how sure without being loud. Historians still argue whether most people in the Middle Ages pictured their world as a web of places strung together by stories, rather than as a set of distances measured in miles. You murmur, in love with the debate, because it matches the way your day unfolded. A web is exactly what it feels like. Pull one strand, an oak, a shrine, a smell, and the nearest strand answers, river, cross, cottage, and the tremble tells you which way is out of the maze. Miles are fine, stories are friendlier. You find a place to sleep where the lane relents into a byre, sweet hay, old straw, the polite smell of cow. You ask with your eyes, your hands, and a copper, and you're granted a square of loft and a corner of stew. You eat like a creature who believes in tomorrow. Then you step outside for the last directions of the day, which are no longer about movement. The village cross is a silhouette against a sky powdered with first stars. The air tastes of wood smoke and pie crust. If anyone were to ask you where you are on a map you don't own, you'd point at the cross, then at yourself, and you'd say, here, temporarily. Tomorrow I'll be over there, briefly, and in between I'll be in the part of the road that smells like mint. You go back inside, and lie down in the hay, the itchy kind of comfortable that's charming, because you've decided it is. You let the day replay in the slow motion of memory, the oak, the hill scar, the spire, the wayside cross at the fork. The boy with the ferret and the efficient wisdom, the hold stone, the ferry, the pollarded willows, the hollow way like a green-walled thought, the shrine at the fork, the boundary stone slouching into grass. You realize that if someone asked you to write a map, you could. But it would be strange to anyone who hadn't lived your footsteps. It would say things like turn left after the hawthorn that refuses to be moved, then continue until the world starts to taste like apples. You smile in the dark, which is a wonderful use of darkness. When you fall asleep, you do so with your palm still feeling the cool of stone, cross, boundary, shrine, and your mind still tracing the line of giants on the horizon. The road will wake you in the morning and demand another story. You'll give it one, and it will deliver you, one landmark at a time, one gentle instruction after another. Follow the breeze that smells like rain, keep the ridge where your confidence is taller, walk until the spire finds you. Pass the cross that has watched you go by every year of your life, even if you only just met today. You wake to a hush, rinsed by night rain. The cross on the green wears beads of water. A sparrow on its cap approves your itinerary. You climb for the ridge, not because ridges are fastest, but because they let your eyes do half the work. Every few minutes you swivel, pinning giants to the horizon. The squat tower missing a corner, a chalk scar pale as bone, a spire scolding the sky. Keep the tower at 10 o'clock, the scar ahead, the spire drifting left. You tell yourself, it isn't cartography, it's choreography. The path shoulders into rough grass and onto a firm spine. Beacon Hill, locals call it, because when the world is nervous, this is where it lights a sentence of fire. Mainstream fact taps your sleeve. Chains of beacon hills ran across parts of medieval and early modern England, flaring in sequence for warning or news, cliff answering cliff like cousins passing a note. You stand where brush once waited, and read the country, as if it were a book with generous margins. Near the crest, a white figure gleams, chalk skin where the hillside shows its bone, quirky tidbit nods. Chalk hill figures, like the Uffington white horse, are kept alive by scouring, villagers cutting turf and cleaning lines, so the shape stays bright. People use them as bearings long after the original makers were finished explaining themselves. Historians still argue whether the Uffington creature is a horse, a dragon, or an elegant logo for this way please. You wave anyway, and let it anchor you to the morning. You drop from the ridge into a green lane, where ferns hang like curtains and birds practice scales. A low clapper bridge stitches two soggy banks with slabs of moorstone. You cross in 3 patient steps, the way you carry a saucer of soup. At the elbow of the path stands a hold stone. You look through it and line up the spire in the ring, one landmark introducing another like a generous host. By a willow, a woman with a creel of eels gives directions the way a good singer gives tempo. Keep the sycamore that forks like gossip. Pass the weeping cross, you'll know it. The steps where tears, and take the lane that smells like pennies. Mainstream fact nods. Weeping Cross is a common name for preaching or penitential crosses, where processions paused and sermons gathered the weather into meaning. The steps under this one curve into soft crescents. You sit for a minute, donate one quiet thought, then stand and keep moving. Past the cross, the penny's lane earns its rumor, iron sweet air from a spring that ferries minerals to your nose. A rag tree leans over it, hung with faded cluties. Quirky tidbit drifts in like incense at some holy wells. People tie rags for healing wishes. The wind reads the petitions until the fabric thins into answered silence. You don't tie anything. You already carry exactly what you can. Bread, water and a roadmap spelled in other people's kindness. A mile on, a moot oak spreads shade that decides disputes whether it wants to or not. 2 tracks meet beneath and consider being one. A reeve and a carter debate ford versus stepping stones. You weigh the knee depth of each and choose the stones. First joke of the afternoon arrives politely. You tell the river you'll avoid baptism today. The river counters that its conversation is immersive. The stones put you on the parish's other tongue. Here the markers lean different. The crosses are plainer. Fingerposts fuss more about distance than about who built the spire. A woman fixing a gate says, 2 miles to the mill, or if you're sensible, 1 song and a half. You accept the superior unit. A tumulus humps from pasture like a loaf under a green cloth. The children call it sleeping bread, which you adopt into your story road. Nobody loses their way when the next instruction is walk until the sleeping bread is behind you. Historians still argue whether beacon chains were meticulously planned by Crown and Shire, or held together by neighbouring parishes, half bureaucracy, half neighbourliness. You think as the hill slides behind you. You like the answer that says both. A plan works best when hands adopt it. Same with crosses. A stone can be planted by authority, but it becomes navigational only when the village folds it into errands and gossip. Down in the next dip, 4 lanes arrive at a cross with different moods. Cart worn, hoof stitched, grass soft, town confident. On the plinth someone has scratched. Always behold the cross by which you have come. You take the advice literally and look back. The lane has already healed half your footprints. Direction is partly gratitude. You practice some. A peddler with a pack of pots clatters out of the hoof-stitched lane and sells you nothing but gives you everything. A rhyme, past Fox Earth and Thorn, where the black thorns borne by Barrow and Stile, keep north for a mile, then Whitestone and Spring where the wagtails sing. You repeat it until it sits in your mouth the way bread sits after butter. It joins your story road like a new verse that remembers the tune. By evening the square of a small hamlet gathers you in. A soft-voiced inn, a lich gate to the right, a market cross that doubles as the village's polite loudspeaker. Beacon Hill is now only a dark idea against a dust-blue west. If someone lit it this moment, a reply would leap ridge to ridge, a slow applause of fire. You trade your rhyme for stew and a corner by the door. Before sleep, you step outside and memorize the square, because tomorrow's first instruction will be keep the elm at your back, until the path begins to smell faintly of apples. When you lie down, the day arranges itself quietly in you. Landmarks, big, stubborn, generous. Crosses, blessing you for arriving and for leaving. Story roads, memory-building bridges, where maps don't reach. You roll to your other side and let sleep be an old country with familiar signposts. If you dream, the dream is courteous. A white horse on a hill, a clapper bridge, a rag tree speaking in ribbons, a rhyme that finds its way home. Before you drift off, one last thought pads over like a cat. Some crosses did numbers as well as blessings. Mainstream fact, tidy and pleased in a few towns, market or boundary crosses carried carved marks or attached plaques, market days, toll notices, even rough distances, which turned holy stone into a bulletin board. the weather couldn't blow away. And along old lines, Roman milestones still haunted hedgerows. Farmers pinched the stones for steps and troughs, but the mile, the 1,000 paces kept echoing in mouths and measures. Historians still argue whether ordinary people thought first in miles or in time. You yawn and choose the measure that always works. One friendly landmark to the next. Spire to cross. Cross to bridge. Bridge to elm. Elm to bed. Tomorrow you will add a few more beads to the thread, and call it a route. Tonight you let the beads go still, small and shining in the dark. Pilgrim signs and milestones. You set out with a staff that knows your hand and a hat that has learned to balance a pewter badge without wobbling. Morning combs light through the hedges. A bell upstream washes its bronze voice down the valley to do the polite job of telling everyone the day is open for business. You step into the road with that small ceremonial pause. A traveler learns, 1 foot hovering, a breath measured, a glance to make sure the sky is still where you left it. Your fingers brush the scallop shell tied to your pack. It taps against the leather like a well-mannered reminder. Yes, today again. The road you follow is not just a road, it's a sentence other feet began, and your feet keep finishing. It has its grammar, shrines that punctuate, crosses that capitalize, milestones that insist on numeracy, even when your legs prefer poetry. The first sign today is a wooden board nailed to a post, painted with a hand that tried and mostly succeeded, a little pilgrim figure with a big hat and a stick like yours, an arrow that points not at a place but at a direction. You nod. Directions are more honest than places. The lane slackens into a green with a cross at its center, a stone stem with its arms worn to the suggestion of embrace. The top trimmed by weather into a bland humility that suits prayer. The base is stepped, and on one step someone has chalked a scallop, a quick shell of lines, a casual blessing in white. You sit there to eat a heel of bread that could moonlight as a paperweight, and you watch the morning take attendants, drovers, a woman with a basket, and the walk of someone who forgives geese too often. A man whose boots tell you he trusts mud. You ask the oldest pair of eyes, and the eyes answer with a finger. Follow the chalk marks on stones, little shells rightward always after the second bridge. You have learned the language of chalk. It says move, and it says keep moving, which are the two moods a pilgrim needs. Mainstream fact strolls along, unhurried and helpful. The scallop shell becomes the emblem of St. James of Compostela, and pilgrims returning from Galicia wear a real shell to announce to the world, and to gatekeepers who prefer credentials, that they have done what they claim. In other places, the symbol appears everywhere for companionship. Hammered in pewter as hat badges, carved on stones, pressed into bread on feast days. The shell is a small passport that travels on you rather than in you, because you will lose paper but never forget your hat. Historians still argue whether most medieval shells were earned at the coast of Galicia or purchased along the way, a practical grace note for travelers who needed the protection of a recognized symbol before they reached the shrine. You understand both positions. The road is long, and humans are human. Some buy courage when they can't yet earn it. Some earn it and then purchase a prettier version for their hat. You keep your shell simple. It is there to make strangers kind. As you follow the chalk shells, you notice how often signs breed around kindness. There's a shrine set into a wall at a corner, a little vaulted niche, with a painted saint so weathered, he's basically eyebrows and a gesture. Beneath him, hammered into the stone, 4 pewter badges glint dull, a tunic shape for St. Thomas of Canterbury, a flask for Our Lady of Walsingham, a cross potent for Jerusalem, and another scallop shell. They're souvenirs, yes, but also a public whisper. Other feet passed this way, and did not vanish. If you were anxious, and you are always a little anxious, the badges add weight to your courage, like a pebble in the pocket that makes you steadier. Quirky Tidbit leans in with a bright grin. At some great shrines, pilgrims buy small lid or pewter ampulla, little flasks stamped with the saint's image, to carry home water or oil associated with the shrine. At Canterbury, people filled them with Beckett's water, a holy mixture that sometimes included a shaving of the saint's tomb oil. At Ashen, travelers held up mirrors to catch the gilded light reflected from relics, then took those pilgrim mirrors home, carrying souvenir sunlight in the most medieval way imaginable. You think of the way your own face reflects in the inn's black window at night, and wonder if that counts as a relic of your day. Probably not, but it's friendly. Milestones begin to appear with the faint regularity of a heartbeat. The first is a squat cylinder of stone, half buried, its lettering worn to the memory of letters. You squat and rub a finger along the faint grooves, reading like a person tracing the echo of a word. Maybe, and a short chunk that could be a number. Farmers use old milestones for fence posts or steps, but some remain, the ribs of old empires protruding through the skin of the present. You pat it in thanks for surviving. It says nothing. Stones have perfected the art of dignified silence. The next sign is a painted board at the edge of a bridge, put up by a confraternity of the bridge, neighbors who take it upon themselves to keep the planks sane and the tolls sane-ish. Mainstream fact, tidily pleased with itself, in parts of medieval France, groups known as fratres pontifices, brothers of the bridge, raised funds and organized labor to build and maintain river crossings. Elsewhere, guilds and lay brotherhoods adopted bridges and ferries as a form of piety with practical benefits. You walk across knowing some stranger's devotion met you here in timber and iron. A holy act that doesn't get your feet wet is your favorite kind. Historians still argue whether mile counts on old routes started from city gates, market crosses, or some state-sanctioned zero point that officials invented and citizens mostly ignored. You prefer the system in use right now. 1 ham sandwich to the ford, 1 song and a half to the next cross, 2 patient conversations to the inn with the ox on the sign. The league means whatever the local league means, and the practical definition adjusts with the slope. Your hat's badge earns its keep at the next gate. The town has opinions about strangers after sunset, and the porter's eyebrows have opinions about your face. You lift the brim to show the little pewter St. James. Pilgrim, you say, which is shorthand for I have limited money and many acceptable reasons for being in your town. The eyebrows soften. He gestures you through with a sigh that translates to fine, but if you cause any sort of narrative, it better be edifying. You cause no narrative whatever. You aim for a light at ground level where a lantern marks a hospitium, a pilgrim house that specializes in mercy and vegetable stew. Inside, a woman with a ledger and the skills of someone who has taught donkeys manners shows you a pallet and a hook. Signs are simple here, she says, nodding to the wall, a painted scallop for the dormitory, a painted cup for the kitchen, a painted hand for the washroom, and crucially a painted ear for quiet after compline. You track the images the way a child tracks a story, grateful to rest your language a bit. On the table, other travelers lean over a scrap of parchment where someone has sketched a strip map, wavy line for river, dots for bridges, little churches for parishes, where hospitality looks likely. You add a rumor, at the 3rd parish, a milestone stands crooked, because a plough once argued with it. Turn at the crooked stone, you say, and someone writes a tiny leaning cylinder beside the wavy line. Your contribution to cartography is both humble and cheerful. Morning pulls you out again, threads you onto the road, like a bead. Signs multiply with the kind of organic logic that only makes sense to a person walking at your speed. There's a waypost with hands carved into it, literal hands, stone palms pointing toward towns whose names the post has forgotten, but whose directions it remembers. There's a broom tied to a gate, which you learn means market swept clean today, come back tomorrow if you expect bargains. There's the sun traveling at its usual pace, which is either comfortably steady or insulting, depending on the slope. At the corner of 2 lanes, a chapel the size of a convincing opinion tempers the day. Its door is unbarred. Inside, a bench waits with the patience of benches. You sit and watch dust negotiate with sunlight. On the wall, a faded painting of a pilgrim wearing a shell, his staff a little too tall for realism, and perfect for aspiration. At the door, a small basin of water and a slate with chalk, where travelers sign their name or their symbol, 3 dots in a triangle, perhaps, or a little fish, so the next pair of eyes knows the road is warm with company. You draw a minimal shell and a minimal smile next to it, and feel foolish in a holy way. It's good for you. Quirky tidbit arrives wearing sandals, some pilgrims heading to Jerusalem, come home palmers, carrying a palm frond, real or wooden, and the nickname sticks like burrs. Others ink the memory on skin, pilgrim tattoos, simple crosses pricked into wrists by Coptic and Syriac artists in the Holy City. You consider your own wrists, uninked and very much employed in bread holding, and decide your souvenirs can keep being removable. The chalk signature is enough. Your mother, if you had the good sense to have one on this road, would approve. On the next hill, the wind reveals a line of stones like sleepy teeth. They are not graves, not this time. They are the kind of markers that say long way keep faith. Each has a little notch on the lee side, where someone once tucked a candle, and the wax ghosts have left their pale testimony in dribbles. At the base of one stone, a tiny pile of tokens, a copper, a lid badge, a sliver of ribbon, a walnut that will puzzle any archaeologist who has forgotten that lunch is a religion. You add a pebble, with the seriousness of someone adding a syllable to a prayer and move on. The day folds around you. You measure progress by the number of times you swap the staff from one hand to the other to fool your shoulder into thinking you're thoughtful. A shepherd points with his crook. Keep to the causeway until you see the road shrine with the red cloth, he says. Not the blue cloth, that's for cows. You nod gravely. It makes sense in the way that only this place can make sense. Color coding at scale, blessed fabric fluttering from a little roofed box set into the hedge, the red one for people, the blue tucked lower, you notice when you pass. Tied by a farmer, who knows which saints care for cloven hooves. Mainstream fact flicks its book open again. The Via Francigena, one of the great arteries of pilgrimage from the north to Rome, is known to us in part because an English archbishop named Sigaric wrote an itinerary around the year 990, listing his stopping places from Rome back to Canterbury, 80-some stages like beads you can still finger on a map. 1,000 years later, the idea remains: break the world into nights, and the days will behave. You carry your own itinerary, written in food and benches and the sight of towers, and it works as well as anyone's. Historians still argue whether official signs for pilgrims painted saints' carved shells were abundant or sporadic, whether most guidance lived in uniform symbols or in word of mouth and charity. Your experience votes for both, and also bread. You follow shells scratched into plaster, but you also follow a woman's elbow when it points firmly toward a safe ford, and you follow the smell of stew around a corner when the road has nothing to say. The advice that reaches your nose first wins. By noon, milestones begin to bargain with your feet. One says, Ida in a Roman mood, another in a later hand says 3 and then to the cross in a spelling that makes you want to hug whoever tried. You learn to distrust any stone that promises a mile, and delivers 2, but you also learn that stones measure a geometry of stone, whereas blood measures a geometry of longing and inconvenience. If the stone says 3 miles, and your legs say 1 more song, you side with your legs. They have been carrying your head for years without complaint, they deserve a vote. A small brotherhood of St. James keeps a hostel at the next village, and has done so long enough to engrave its hum into the air. The doorway is marked by a shell carved in oak. A cord hangs there for the thirsty to ring. Inside, a ledger records names, places, vows. You copy your own name as if it were a new friend and watch the fresh ink settle into the old page. The warden, a man whose smile creases in exactly the places that reassure, points to a wall of walking sticks left by pilgrims too tired to carry them into eternity. One has a row of notches cut into it. 10, 20, 30, each notch a day a distance, each distance a story. You palm your own staff, and feel the faint itch where you might carve your first mark tonight. This is how milestones move from road to wood to bone. After a bowl of soup that improves your vocabulary for gratitude, you step back into the afternoon, a soft-edged thing that smells like honey and cart grease. The road sways toward a ridge where someone has set a tall column with a cross on top, a calvary, the local calls it, a stop on processions, a pointer in fog, a stage for announcements when news needs a higher voice. You stand in its shadow, and let the world tilt around you until you know which way is down again. On the column's base, someone has scratched a little ship, sails taut and naive. The universal sign for this was carved by a hand thinking of far water. You touch the ship, and half adopt its courage. The next sign is your favorite of the day, not stone, not wood, but a person. An old woman sits on a stool at a bend, shell pinned to her shawl like a moon. She holds a basket with 3 apples and the confidence of someone who invented both apples and baskets. A donation for St. James, she says, offering the basket without touching it. You take an apple and a direction. Follow the poplars, she says, as if poplars could be anything but followed. You thank her, and move on, chewing the apple slowly so it lasts the length of the poplars, which is precisely the right length for an apple to last. Quirky tidbit flutter kicks in from memory. Labyrinths set into cathedral floors, chart, for one sometimes serve as a devotional stand-in for longer journeys. People walk their circles in quiet procession, turning and turning toward the center, a symbolic pilgrimage for feet that can't leave town that year. Historians still argue whether such labyrinths were regularly used that way in the Middle Ages, or only later, but either way, the pattern keeps the idea alive. Holy travel can be measured in steps or in intention, and intention is a remarkably portable unit. Toward late light, the road coaxes you across a narrow stone bridge that is more nerve than structure. A figure cut into the parapet blesses you as you pass. On the far side, a milestone leans into a hawthorn as if they share secrets. You check the inscription, scratched but legible enough to read a number that promises fewer miles than your feet would tell you if you were foolish enough to ask them. Fifth joke of the day, kindly and tired, you pat the stone and say, "We'll both lie a little if it gets us to supper faster." The stone, stalwart in its ethics, refuses to participate in any more lies than erosion has already made of it. Evening comes with its sweet habit of polishing everything smooth. You find a field path that wears the shell symbol like a little crown. At its end, a low house squats with satisfaction, an old hospice, whose doorway has met more dust than most cities. You can tell it's a pilgrim house by the multilingual sigh contained in the word welcome when the door opens. Inside, a fresher sign waits on a beam. Someone has painted a long, slow yellow line with little ticks at pleasing intervals, and beneath the line, the names of towns you have heard, and the ones you hope to hear. It is as if a child drew a timeline and persuaded everyone else to believe in it. You do. You always wanted to be persuaded by kindness and chalk. After bread and a stew that clearly ended a vegetable's career in public service, you sit with others around a table that has kept secrets for generations. A man with a sunburned nose counts distances on his fingers. A young woman mends her shoe with a needle that respects her authority. An old monk points at the beam's painted ticks and recalls a time a flood scolded the road into being a river for a week. You donate your crooked milestone to the story. It enters the common inventory of signs. Turn at the stone that leans into the hawthorn like it means it. Tomorrow someone will trust your simile more than they trust any numbers. You sleep where many have slept, under a roof that creaks with the contentment of beams that have seen worse storms. In your dreams, the signs of the day rearrange themselves into a grammar of reassurance, a shell that becomes a candle flame, that becomes a hand pointing to a bowl of soup, that becomes a bell that does not ring alarm, but home time. You wake before dawn and find the beam again. You touch your next town's name with your fingertip the way a child taps the page when the good part is coming. Then you shoulder your pack, straightening it as if it bears not only bread and blanket, but also the sum of every sign that has been kind to you. Dawn is new parchment. The first line you write on it is a small wooden finger post, where the paint glows faintly, as if last evening's sun stayed behind on duty. Market, Mill, St. Mary. You go towards St. Mary, because churches are good at being where other important things are. Along the lane, tiny shells are nailed to trees at intervals that match the rhythm of walking and looking. Each shell is a syllable. Together they form a word you can speak with your feet. A man with a barrow complains with the joy of a person who likes complaining. "These milestones," he says, "tell lies. 3 miles yesterday, and it was 4 if it was a feather." You offer the polite confession of a fellow sufferer. "Leagues," he continues, "are just miles with better shoes." You nod as if you agree because being agreeable is the pilgrim's most flexible tool. At the next crossroad, he turns off singing a song about somebody named Joan and a pie. His voice fades. The road keeps singing in its own key: stone, wood, water, wind. Late morning brings you to a boundary where 2 parishes have negotiated a truce in stone, a cross cut on one side, a different cross on the other, saints facing their own flocks. You stand between them for a little while, and feel neutrally blessed. A new milestone here declares a whole number in freshly cut confidence, and then undercuts itself with a smaller, older number scratched by someone who disagreed. The stone is a forum. The forum is a footnote war. You stay out of it. Your feet cast the deciding vote in the only court that matters. Beyond, a long straight stretch owns the afternoon. The sun shows off. You water yourself like a plant that is fond of living. The next sign is low, almost shy, a little stone set in the bank with a carved foot. Not a fancy foot, just a foot. "Pilgrim," says the foot. "Go this way." You put your own foot beside it, and feel the size of history, a little larger than yours, a little smaller, perfectly the same. Someone told you last winter that if you ever felt lost, you could walk until you reached a river or a road with more confidence than yours, and then ask the first sign you met to introduce you to the next. That is exactly what signs are for. Introductions. A shell introduces you to a shrine, a milestone introduces you to patience, a bridge plaque introduces you to the neighbors who want you to arrive alive. You are being introduced all day, and your manners improve. By the time the light goes slow and tender, you are counting ticks on the beam in your mind, measuring the day with the kind of satisfaction that doesn't need witnesses. Assume. You step into a town whose cross is busy with market memories, and whose hostel hangs a lantern at about your height, as if the world has learned your shape.
The shell on your pack clinks when you set it down, a small cheerful bell. You add one notch to your staff with a borrowed knife, counting not miles, but days well navigated by kindness. In the murmur before sleep, you inventory the things that told you where to go: chalk shells, stone crosses, wooden finger posts, a milestone with a number and an attitude. A bridge built by a promise, a hostel beam painted by someone who loved lists, a boundary that blessed both sides, a foot carved in stone, a woman with 3 apples and a direction, a rhyme you forgot, and then remembered just in time. The world wants you to get there, you think. The world prefers you found over you lost. Historians still argue whether Pilgrim signs made travel easy, or merely less discouraging. You smile into your blanket, because you have the answer that matters from a day's experiment. The signs make walking feel like reading a book that believes in you. Assume. Milestones don't shorten the road, but they keep your hope from running ahead alone. Crosses don't push, they promise. Shells don't guarantee safety, they recruit it. And you, slow as a paragraph, and just as steady, keep turning the pages with your feet. You fall asleep to a final small joke, the kind that doesn't wake anyone. If the milestones lied a little, it was the kind of lie that keeps you moving. Tomorrow's stones will lie on your behalf as well, subtracting a worry here, adding a kindness there, until the sum equals arrival.
Reading rivers and stars. You begin the day with your hands dipped in cold water, and your mind tuned to the river's voice. It's a talkative voice, silver syllables over stones, a hush where the bank cups the flow, a hiss where rushes comb the current into threads. You test its temperature with the backs of your fingers, and pretend you were always the sort of person who knows what this means. It means wake up. Water is fluent in tough love. The air smells like nettle and wet rope. A heron disapproves of you from a polite distance, which is the heron's main hobby. You fall into step beside the current because rivers make promises. Roads sometimes forget. A road might wander off to visit somebody's cousin. A river either goes to the sea or throws a tantrum and becomes a lake. Those are your options. You read the channel as if it were a script. Riffles mean shoals and easy crossings. Green glassy tongues mean depth. Foam spirals show where stones hide just under the surface like inconvenient secrets. On the outside of a bend, the bank is bitten. On the inside, it has crumbs, sandbars where the water loosens its grip. The river is a long sentence, and today you are very willing to be its comma. Mainstream fact arrives like a sober friend with a map you can fold. Towns and fords and mills cluster around reliable water because power and passage and drink all like the same address. Bridges tend to appear where the river behaves, over rock or narrowings, and roads braid around those bridges the way threads gather at a needle's eye. If you are ever unsure, aim for the sound of steady water and the smell of yeast. Where grain meets a wheel, people meet you with answers. You bank left where a willow has perfected the art of leaning. The ground there is trampled into an argument between hooves and heels, a good sign. On the opposite bank, the color is different, darker with silt where cartwheels climbed last week. Your path enters a hollow way and then opens to a ford, stones set low like a row of teeth too shy for the dentist, water licking them into patience. Someone has pushed a stake at the far edge and tied a rag to it. Today it's blue, a reminder to turn left after crossing. If you don't like walking through a marsh that eats socks, you step, each foot placed the way you set a cup back on a trestle table you don't own. The water works at your calves like an insistent aunt. On the last stone, your boot slides a little. You correct with the dignity of a person pretending to bow. First joke of the morning, you tell the river you'd love to stay, but your schedule is fully booked with not drowning. Historians still argue whether travelers preferred valleys or ridgeways as their default, you think, climbing the bank, wringing your cloak at the fringe. The valley offers water and company, and the temptation to be robbed politely. The ridge offers wind and honesty, and the temptation to be weather. You vote by forecast. Today the clouds are merciful and the river is good company, so you follow its grammar. Quirky tidbit pops up like a trout. Some old fords were marked by sheaves stuck upright in the shallows, replaced after floods by whoever remembered not to drown last time. Elsewhere, a priest's cause of stepping stones lifted clergy dry foot across parish water, a courtesy extended to secular feet whenever clergy weren't looking. You imagine a queue of sinners apologizing with each step, and decide to be lightly sinful later if it earns you a shortcut now. You walk and the river's talk changes with the width of the valley. A mill appears, low and competent, wheels slapping like a metronome that knows supper is at stake. You pause where the tail race rushes back to the mother flow, watch the water's shoulders relax after work, and listen to the miller evaluate the weather by the taste of the wind. He points with his chin. Don't use the upper ford, it sulked after the last storm, he says. Take the ferry cut, follow the pollards. You thank him with a coin and a promise to speak well of flour. Past the mill, you find a causeway, lifted a foot or two above the surrounding sogginess, cobbles set in a herringbone that suggests someone cared enough to pattern even what you rarely see. A little plank bridge hops a ditch. On the far post, a charcoal arrow aims you to a fresher path under alder. An otter slides off a rock like a coin slipping from a careless sleeve. The river becomes a long green corridor with the light wrinkled by leaves. You hum a song you learned 2 parishes back, because humming is cheaper than bread and nearly as nourishing. Midday nudges you uphill to a promontory where the river shows off its decisions. Seg curve, gravel fan, a darker streak where a deep channel keeps secrets. From here you can see how low meadows flaunt haycocks and how orchards keep a respectful distance. Floods have a memory and trees prefer to gossip about it from the slope. Mainstream fact taps your shoulder. River names turn into place names and job names and families. Anything called Ford, Bridge, Fleet, Bourne, Wick or Widge has been shaking hands with water for longer than memory. Say Oxford out loud, and you taste cows crossing. Say Cambridge, and you hear a scholar explaining why a bridge needs a college. The sun is soft metal now, not yet hot enough to argue. You use it the way a careful person uses a knife, certainly, but with attention. You hold out your arm and stack your fist against the sky, a rough measure. Your fist is about 10 degrees if you are the average human, with the average fist and the average desire not to be lost. You count how far the sun has moved since your last decision. It's not exact science, but it's practical poetry. Your shadow gets shorter toward noon, and that's a sort of sermon you can trust. You pass under a lich gate, yew needles make the light taste herbal. Inside the church smells like beeswax, and people reminding themselves why they're kind. You step back outside, and feel orientation fall into place, as if someone set a compass behind your eyes. Mainstream fact, content with its usefulness, many medieval churches keep their altars roughly toward the east, ad orientem. So even if a tower bends a bit to please a hill or a mason, the building longs toward dawn. You tilt your head, line the chancel up with an idea of sunrise, and file north and south away inside your skull for later. The churchyard gate clicks behind you with the air of a teacher telling a class to discuss among themselves. Afternoon loosens. You rejoin the river where it broadens, the banks flattened by centuries of opinion. A ferry bell hangs from a beam, and a sign suggests ringing, if you prefer not to memorize how to swim. The ferryman, hat like a roof, punts across with the relaxed competence of a person who knows 80 ways the river can be annoying, and 90 ways to discourage it. Ebb in an hour, he says, nodding at the current. If you follow her then she'll show you sand where she was water. You file that under helpful poetry. On the far bank a line of willows stands in uniform, pollarded heads like lollipops, living milestones, each trunk a chapter in the parish's book of repairs, each cut an entry written with a saw. Quirky tidbit waves from the tide. In a few ports, bells marked the turn of the tide, because timing lanes and ferrying cattle depended on someone's ear being punctual. Elsewhere, tide mills harnessed the sea's breath, incoming filled the pond, outgoing turned the wheel. You like the idea that the moon can be persuaded to do useful work while everyone is asleep. Historians still argue whether travelers used the Milky Way as a literal night road. You consider squinting at the pale band even in your mind's daylight. Some called it the Way of St. James, the heavenly echo of the earthly Camino, a ribbon to guide souls rather than boots. Did anyone actually follow it with their feet? Maybe not. But when people named the sky after a journey, they confessed what you already feel. Distance is easier when the universe is on your side. The day tilts into evening, and the river exhales fog along its margins like a sigh it's been holding since spring. You leave its voice to whisper to frogs and climb to dry ground for the night. You prefer sleeping where dew is an option rather than a lifestyle. The field you choose has a hedge that knows how to block wind and a view that promises tomorrow an honest conversation. You feather a small fire into being, no drama, just comfort, and wait while the sky learns its stars again. Night does its gentle reveal, 1, 2, 10, and then the black goes velvet with pricks of salt. You look for the Big Dipper well plow, Wayne stars answer to many names, and finding it, you extend the line from the bowl's far side 5 times, and there she is, Polaris lantern near the top of the world. It isn't exactly nailed to the sky's hinge, never has been, not in any century that loved beef and bells, but it's close enough to be trustworthy, and at this hour you love nothing better than a trustworthy speck. You check the angle between Polaris and your horizon with the instruments you have, your arm, your fist, your willingness to be approximately right. The altitude tells you roughly where you are north to south, if you're the sort of person who keeps a mental yardstick in latitude. You are not that sort, you are the sort who wants to know whether you're drifting. The answer is probably not. Mainstream fact brings tools to the blanket. Sailors grew friendly with the mariner's astrolabe and the quadrant, brass hoops and quarter circles for measuring star heights. Landwalkers borrowed when they could, or made do with sighting along a stick, a cross staff to smarten the idea. A nocturolabe, clever cousin of a sundial, could tell time by the loop of Polaris and the little dipper around it. If you knew your stars like you knew your bread, you sight along your thumb for free, because your budget prefers equipment that doesn't mind rain. Historians still argue whether such instruments wandered far inland before the 15th century, you think, laying your staff beside you like a sleeping dog. The evidence is shy. You decide that a person with a parcel and a deadline will adopt any device that pays for its own weight. Everyone else adopts patience. Your pack is deliberately low-tech: bread, blanket, spare socks, a tiny knife that treats cheese like a negotiation. The sky is your expensive instrument. You rent it nightly at very reasonable rates. The stars arrange themselves into old gossip. Cassiopeia slouches opposite the dipper. When the dipper hides low in summer, she takes over pointing duties, her W like the crown of someone who never learned to sit modestly on furniture. You use the two constellations as a balance scale. If the dipper is a poor guide tonight, Cassiopeia volunteers. Orion hauls himself up in winter with his 3 belt stars in a scolled straight row. Follow them down and left, and you will meet Sirius, so bright it looks like a door slightly ajar. You greet Orion when he's in season the way you greet a neighbor who only winters here but always brings stories. Quirky tidbit crackles with distant northern rumor. Sailors' tales talk about a sunstone, a crystal Iceland spar. Some say that reveals the sun's secret spot through cloud and gloaming by polarizing the sky's scattered light. Did Vikings actually use it? The sagas are coy, the stones exist, experiments nod, the historians still argue like wind at a tent flap. You file the idea under useful if true, charming if not, and you peer through your thumb and fist instrument at nothing in particular, suddenly pleased with cheap tools. The fire settles to a red grammar. Far off, a dog edits the night. Your stomach proposes a treaty with your bread. You accept and then lie back, spine on earth, eyes on stars, the long axis of you laid between geographies. The Milky Way spills, dense as flour on a dark table. You think of names: road of birds, road of straw, road of souls. You prefer the one that tastes like journey. You are, after all, a creature who will follow anything that promises this way. Historians still argue whether ordinary villagers knew the sky well, or only as a seasonal rumor. You muse as your eyelids negotiate with gravity. Agricultural calendars existed. Saints were hitched to weather, but did most people know star by star? Perhaps not as a catalogue. But you suspect everyone owned a handful of sky facts the way everyone owns proverbs, practical shards that catch the light when you need them. You keep yours simple. The dipper points, Cassiopeia substitutes. Orion keeps winter honest in doubt. Find north, and admit it. You wake to the kind of pre-dawn that feels like a secret. The river below exhales mist like a dragon that learned manners. You stamp your feet the approved number of times and watch the east blush. The first line of light is a razor that turns fields into pages. You point your nose toward it, and collect the day's first directions from the way frost releases one hedge before another. Cold is an excellent cartographer. Back at the river, a fisherman with hands like weather offers you his morning as a unit of measure. 3 casts to the footbridge, he says. 2 to the deep bend where she sits. 1 to the willow if you want your hook back all afternoon. He means trout. You translate into distance like a native now, cast lengths and song ends and apple lifespans. He tells you not to trust the smooth water below the old weir. It pretends calm above a boil. You thank him with the reverence due a person who speaks both fish and current. The valley narrows into a throat, the river squeezes and quickens, and your path climbs a rib to keep its shoes. From up here you read the water's intentions, where white raking means stones, where glass means depth, where a slate blue V means the push between boulders. On a sunlit bank, clothes steam on a hedge, someone's laundry taking the sacrament of heat.
A child turns and waves without pausing in the important business of existing. The wave says people here, which your map translates as bread here, which is exactly the sort of efficient symbology you love. Mainstream fact drops in with a sailor's gait. Even though you are on land, latitude becomes less of a mood and more of a measurement. The closer you drift to coasts that trade in horizons. A simple stick and shadow can tell noon. A quadrant can tell how tall the sun is. A sailor can tell you where he is within the kind of rectangle you can draw on a chart. Longitude cheats and sulks for centuries, refusing to behave until clocks get over their seasickness. On foot you don't mind. You live in a world of parish widths and day lengths, of before complying and after the bell, of reach the bridge before the ferryman changes his mind. Historians still argue whether walkers ever used star height to maintain a course on land the way seafarers aimed along a parallel. You think as a hawk writes a comma over the field. Perhaps merchants with habit and time did. You rely instead on a method less noble but more nourishing. Keep the river on the side you promised. Keep the sun from surprising you, and let the churches remind your bones of east. By noon you reach an estuary's faint mood, miles inland but already feeling the tug. The water tastes slightly argumentative. Reeds whisper gossip they learned from the sea. Boats squat on mud like cattle that wandered into a philosophy lecture. A gull practices its impression of a magistrate. You watch the tide bear ribs of sand and understand suddenly the logic of placing causeways and chapels on knuckles of raised ground where the sea has to ask permission. Quirky tidbit sidles up. Some islands wear chapels as if the building were an anchor. When the causeway floods, prayers and patience keep company until the tide returns your road. Every local knows the timetable in their kneecaps. Strangers learn quickly or become stories. You step away from the pull before you decide to be bivalve for the afternoon. Inland again, the river softens into its domestic voice. Mills, pollards, washing stones with the rounded polish of generations of hands. You pass a stone with a shallow cup cut in its top. A saint's well, or merely a practical place to leave a coin, but either way it says people stop here. You oblige. The cup holds rainwater with a single leaf floating like a tiny boat tile. You spend nothing but attention and move on richer. A shepherd tops the rise with a dog whose trot says professional. He points with his crook and offers a rhyme you immediately adopt. When water's brown and quick and loud, the high track is your friend. When water's pale and slow and proud, the valley's your best end. You revise it twice so it fits in your mouth, and then keep it for sad weather. Second joke of the day, you thank him as if he sells policies. He says without smiling, "We do." He and the dog move on, the kind of partnership the stars would envy if they weren't so far away. The afternoon grows buttery, and everyone pretends they invented it. You refill at a spring where iron stains the stone into freckles, and you read the lay of land with your nose. Mint says water, wild garlic says edge of wood, wet wool says someone's day is going just fine. You tuck one ear for bells, one for water, leave the rest of you for bird song. Your staff's tip learns the rhythm of the cobbles. Tap, hush, tap, and you realize contentment has been sneaking along in your shadow. By early dusk you are back to your nightly astronomy, which is less science and more friendship. Clouds march in with too much enthusiasm, and your star catalogue becomes theoretical. No dipper to point, no Cassiopeia to gossip. You practice the apprentice trick. If you know yesterday's north and you haven't turned in your sleep while walking unlikely, keep faith with your last known good direction, and let wind and hedge confirm you. The river below mutters in the dark, its voice shifts with the bends, a left ear story, then a right ear story, then silence where a deep pool holds its breath. You walk by sound for a little while, the way you walk by smell when bread is nearby. The senses are a choir, you are just the conductor who pretends the music is your idea. Mainstream fact taps the lantern, the compass is your eventual friend. When the sky sulks, a simple lodestone needle floating in a cup knows more than you do about north. You've seen a merchant show one off like a pet that knows a single trick. You felt envy. Historians still argue whether compasses on land were rare toys or common tools before the late Middle Ages, you recall. Either way you make do. You count steps, you trust hedges, you accept that your ankles own a better map than your mouth. Fog rises from the water and builds a small city you are not invited to live in. You retreat to higher ground with the dignified speed of someone who knows that will-o'-the-wisps are either methane or mischief, and that both lead to the same address. Quirky tidbit tilts a lantern. Tales say blue dancing lights lure walkers from the safe path. Wiser tales say don't chase lights you didn't ask for. You look up, the clouds thin, a scrap of Polaris peaks like a friend at a window waving you on with 2 fingers. You bow to it with only the expected amount of sarcasm. Historians still argue whether medieval travelers actually traveled by night to save time or avoided it like sane people. You think as you choose sanity and a hedgerow. Your experience suggests that the night is a good place to be still unless you have to move, or the sky is so clear that walking feels like being guided by a polite choir. Tonight the choir is on break. You shelter where the ground hums dryness, and the wind puts its back to a bush and invites you to share. You share. In your sleep the river keeps talking, but now it says star names. It says Rigel in a baritone and Deneb in a thread. It says Polaris like a lullaby. In the dream you are a needle, the sky is a bowl of water, and north is a faith that floats as long as you remember to breathe gently. You wake with the immediate certainty that you were learning something, and the equally immediate certainty that it was be kind to your feet. Dawn returns, and with it the best compass of all. You the earth, the sun, the incredibly useful habit of the east to be where it ought to be. The river reflects a pale ribbon of it, and you decide to follow the ribbon until it kinks at a bridge you haven't met yet. Bridges are schools for walkers. They teach you where traffic likes to be, what town has opinions about tolls, which side the inn keeps its door. You find one at last, a single arch set like a shoulder under the day. On the parapet someone has carved a star you can't name, not astronomical accuracy, just a person putting hope into stone. You put your hand on it as if it were a bell pull and step across. Downstream the river widens and pretends not to have moods. You take the higher towpath and practice predicting what the water will do at the next bend. When you're right, you award yourself 1 raisin. When you're wrong, you award yourself 1 raisin, because raisins are not a meritocracy. You pass reed beds like green fir, and hear bitterns practicing their improbable bassoon. A boy scoots past with a bundle of wicker and yells over his shoulder, "Turn at the 2nd footbridge." The first one sulks. You honor this wisdom and discover it is scientific in nature. The first bridge is narrow and splintery, the second understands the concept of ankles. Mainstream fact squeezes your shoulder with approval. In some marsh countries, plank paths and causeways have been laid since prehistory, oak piles sunk into peat, hurdles of wattle woven thick, later stone set with the seriousness of people who know boots rot. The habit survives into every century that hates wet feet. Follow the sound of dry wood under boot and you're already half navigated. Late morning, the high wind herds clouds into useful shapes. You sight their shadows racing across fields and pretend you can predict which hedge will get shade next. When you're right, you feel like a wizard. When you're wrong, you feel like a human. Both are excellent traveling companions. A fingerpost appears at last, new enough to have letters that still argue with the weather. Ferry, market, Saint Bride. You take Saint Bride, because saints are multi-purpose landmarks, and because a chapel perched where a river bends usually comes with a bench that understands knees. By the chapel, a priest with straw on his cassock from Practical Theology points out a line of standing stones you might have missed, their smaller faces turned toward a path the parish has used longer than he has been alive. Keep them on your right, he says, and you won't fall in anything inconvenient. He gives you a blessing which you catch in your hat and wear like a new badge. Quirky tidbit turns the blessing into trivia. Saint Bride, Bridget owns wells and lambs and the kind of gentle courage that knows where the path across the bog actually is. Afternoon tucks its shirt in. You walk the last long stretch with the river off to your shoulder humming about fish. You think of all the things that have pointed you today, water and wind, sun and bells, bridges and stones, saints and gossip, and how none of them shouted. They nudged. That's the right volume for navigation. Anything louder starts to feel like kidnapping. Toward evening, the sky clears to a mathematical mood. You can see the thin moon leaning in the west like a half-closed eye. You remember suddenly, one of those old practical sky facts, when the crescent holds water like a bowl, rain may linger, when it spills fair weather struts. Is it meteorology? Not really. Is it comforting? Very. The first stars arrive, and you take attendance again. Dipper, present. Cassiopeia, present. Polaris, present and punctual. You stretch your arm, stack your fist, check that your sense of north agrees with the star who is paid to care. It does. Third joke slides out, content and small. You thank Polaris for keeping its shift. Polaris, underpaid and uncomplaining, continues to do so. Historians still argue whether travelers timed their days by bells or by shadows. You murmur as you settle your cloak. The practical answer is yes. Bells when they were close enough to borrow the hour, shadows when they weren't. Stars when even bells went to bed. Rivers when none of the above were in the mood. Your answer is all of them. And raisins. The last mile of the evening is always the kindest. The river, tired of being instructive, tells you a story instead. A fox that crossed here, a cart that didn't, a flood that tried to put a mill into retirement and failed. You choose a sleeping place where the ground swells into a sensible pillow, and the view includes a section of sky generous enough to supply directions if you need them. You notch your staff, one small cut, the honest shape of today, and feel that tiny tick of satisfaction a traveler earns by being the animal who leaves and arrives. You eat a heel that has ambitions to outlast you, a cheese that believes in itself, an apple that explains what a good idea sweetness is. You drink river water politely filtered through your cloak, and a sigh. You let your breath synchronize with the slow pulse of the night, one bright speck, one soft rustle, one far dog, one near owl. You count the fists between Polaris and the horizon, not because you need to, but because rituals feed sleep. Before you drift, you assemble your pocket atlas for tomorrow. Follow the river, while it is useful, abandon it when it begins to teach fog, lean on the sun for east, beg a church for the rest, trust the pollards and the miller's chin, take the second bridge that respects ankles. If the dipper is shy, ask Cassiopeia. If the sky is sulky, trust your last good north, and your most recent dry hedge. If you meet a shepherd, trade him a joke for a rhyme. Fourth joke, drowsy but punctual. If all else fails, walk downhill until you hear either bread or trouble. Bread you can eat, trouble you can go around. Sleep takes you kindly. In your last waking thought, the earth is a slow-turning boat, the river its wake, the stars, the lamps along a quay you will never fully reach. You do not need to. The light is enough, the direction is enough. The going itself is the map. You wake once in the inked part of night, and get the rare gift a sky with no cloud at all, a bowl of dark full of salt. You sit up for it, because there are things you stand for, and things you sit for, and this is the latter. You check north again, not because it moved, but because you like hello. You draw an imaginary line from the dipper's pointers to Polaris and think, not for the first time, it is a small miracle that something so far away keeps promises to creatures as preoccupied as we are. You lie back down and use that thought as a blanket. At dawn, grey as a friendly cat, you go down to the river one last time. It has changed its mood in the night, as if to keep you interested. The surface is tight, the color different, the voice lower, ebb, just as the ferryman predicted. Sand gleams where water refused to be. A heron lifts and folds the morning once, twice, three times, then edits itself into the mist. You take your first steps with that little ceremonial pause again, 1 foot hovering, a breath balanced, a glance to be sure the sky remembered its job description. It did. You follow the water until the hill asks you to read stars again tonight. You say yes, because saying yes to the sky is easier than saying no. And you go on, a reader of currents and constellations, smiling at how the world keeps leaving you notes on stones and on dark, on wind and on bells, on rivers and on stars. You pick them up, read them out loud with your feet, and find that every sentence ends, wonderfully and reliably, in arrive. Fifth joke, whispered so as not to wake the heron. If the stars ever do fall, you promise to put them back. They've been so good to you.
As you settle back, let the last edges of the day soften like lamplight on a quiet lane. You've walked far enough for one night. The roads can keep their own company. The bells will mind the hour without you. Hedges breathe, rivers hush, and the stars keep a kindly watch, steady points you don't have to steer by anymore. You can let your shoulders drop and allow the story's gentle rhythm to finish the walking on your behalf. If sleep comes quickly, let it. Nothing here is urgent. If your mind wanders, give it an easy task. Follow a calm river bend, count the slow steps from cross to gate, trace a simple shape in the sky, and let it fade. Every breath releases a little more noise from the day. Inda like cool night air, out like a small boat sliding from the bank. The ground is friendly, the blanket is warm, and the world will still be here when morning remembers your name. You're safe to drift. The paths you've heard about tonight don't demand anything from you now. They're happy to be imagined at half speed, like a lantern swinging in a doorway. If you wake later, don't worry about where you left off. The story is circular, like a village green. You can rejoin it anywhere, and it will feel familiar. If you make it to the end awake, consider it a gentle victory. If you sleep, that's the better one. Rest in the knowledge that people have always found their way by small, kind signs, some carved in stone, some carried in the hand, some shining a little brighter than the rest. Tonight those signs can do their work without you. Close your eyes, let the quiet do the guiding. You're allowed, fully and simply, to rest. Thank you for listening to the story tonight. Good night.